The smell hit me first. Not the usual comfort of decay, vanilla lignin and settling dust, but something sharp. Ozone. Like a storm had just broken inside the climate-controlled silence of the St. Jude archive. I froze, my hand hovering over the humidity sensor I was calibrating. It was 2:17 a.m. The only things breathing in this basement should have been me and the ventilation system. I turned slowly toward my desk. The blood drained from my face. My leather-bound journal, the one I kept locked in the bottom drawer, was sitting wide open. And the chair facing it was warm. The St. Jude archive wasn't just a library. It was a tomb for things people wanted to forget but couldn't bear to destroy. I loved it here. The night shift was my sanctuary. Or it used to be. For the last month, the silence had felt crowded. It started with small things. A 16th century grimoire shelved 2 millimeters to the left. A fine layer of dust on the rolling stacks disturbed, not by a draft, but by movement. And the scent. It wasn't the musty sweetness of old paper. It was cold, cloying, and distinct. Funeral lilies frozen in ice. I'd told myself it was the HVAC system acting up. Or maybe just the isolation finally cracking my brain. But tonight, staring at my open journal, the denial shattered. This wasn't a security guard doing rounds. Security guards didn't pick locks without scratching the brass. They didn't bypass the biometric scanner on my desk drawer. And they certainly didn't read the private, rambling confessions of a lonely archivist who spent too much time thinking about the texture of loneliness. This was intimate. It was a violation so precise, it felt like a physical touch. I walked to the desk, my boots silent on the concrete. The page was turned to an entry from last Tuesday. I remembered writing it, a pathetic scrawl about craving a connection that didn't demand words, a hunger for something that could match the stillness inside me. The ink looked darker under the halogen lamp, exposed. I felt a flush of heat climb my neck, not just fear, but a sharp, jagged anger. This was my space. These were my ghosts. Someone had walked in here, invaded the one place I felt safe, and treated my inner life like light reading. I reached for the phone on the wall to call the main security desk. My hand stopped inches from the receiver. If I called them, they'd send Marcus, the night supervisor, who looked at me like I was a specimen he hadn't figured out how to pin yet. He'd stomp through the stacks, flashlights blazing, disrupting the delicate ecosystem I maintained. No. The territorial instinct flared in my chest, hot and unfamiliar. I wasn't going to let a stranger trample through my domain. I wanted to see who had the audacity to read my diary. I picked up my bone folder, a heavy Teflon tool used for creasing paper, but solid enough to hurt if you swung it right. It was ridiculous, really. Me, armed with a piece of plastic, hunting an intruder in a subterranean library. But the air in the room felt charged, heavy with that same ozone scent. It pulled at me. I moved out of the lab and into the main stacks. The darkness here was absolute, broken only by the low emergency lights casting long, skeletal shadows between the rows. The temperature dropped. The scent of lilies grew stronger, masking the smell of binding glue. I wasn't just following a trespasser. I was following a trail they wanted me to find. I stopped at the intersection of the medieval history wing. Silence stretched, thick and taut as a bowstring. The rows of books seemed to lean in, listening. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt too loud in the quiet. Then, distinct and deliberate, the sound of a page turning echoed from the restricted section. It was the sound of dry paper sliding against skin. Slow, unhurried. Someone was waiting. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to hide. I wanted to find them. I tightened my grip on the bone folder, took a breath that tasted of electricity, and stepped into the dark. The restricted section was housed behind a floor-to-ceiling iron cage, a barrier meant to keep the humidity constant and the casual browsers out. The gate was unlocked. The heavy latch had been lifted with a precision that didn't scratch the paint. I pushed it open, the hinges screaming in the silence, announcing my arrival better than any shout could have. I wanted her to know I was there. I wanted the intruder to flinch. She didn't. She was sitting at the long mahogany reading table at the end of the aisle, bathed in the singular pool of light from the overhead lamp. She wasn't hunched over like a thief, or tense like someone expecting to be caught. She was leaning back, legs crossed, looking entirely too comfortable in a chair designed to be rigid. I stopped 10 feet away, my grip on the bone folder tightening until my knuckles turned white. The first thing that hit me wasn't fear, but professional outrage. She was holding the Codex Aeterna, a 15th century illuminated manuscript bound in sensitive calfskin, and she wasn't wearing gloves. Her bare fingers were resting directly on the ink of the page. "You're touching it," I said. My voice came out lower than I intended, rough with the adrenaline spiking in my blood. That vellum is 500 years old. The oils from your skin will destroy it. She didn't look up immediately. She finished reading the paragraph, her finger tracing the line of text with a languid, deliberate slowness that made my skin prickle. Then she turned the page. The sound was sharp, dismissive. "It survived wars, fires, and floods, Noah," she said. Her voice was like the room itself, cool, dark, and carrying a resonance that vibrated in my chest. She knew my name. "I think it can survive my touch. Besides, my skin doesn't carry the same biological debris yours does." She finally looked up, and the air left my lungs. She was striking in a way that felt unfair, a collection of sharp angles and soft shadows. Her hair was dark, pulled back loosely, framing a face that was too pale, too perfect, like marble that had learned to smile. But it was her eyes that pinned me to the concrete floor. They were dark, reflective, catching the low light like the surface of a deep well. They didn't blink. They just held me, assessing, consuming. "Who are you?" I demanded, stepping closer despite the instinct screaming at me to run. "How did you get in here? And why were you reading my private journal?" She closed the book with a soft thud. "I'm Seraphina. I walked in through the front door because your locks are charmingly archaic. And as for the journal," she tilted her head, a predator examining a curious noise. "I was looking for something with a pulse. The Codex is dry history. Your writing, however, it bleeds." "That's private," I snapped. "It's not for public consumption." "Is it?" She stood up. The movement was fluid, unnatural. There was no shift in weight, no preparatory tensing of muscles. One moment she was seated, the next she was standing, towering over the table. "You write about loneliness like it's a physical weight. You write about the silence of this place as if you're waiting for it to speak back." "Get out," I said, pointing the bone folder at her. It felt absurdly light in my hand. "Leave now, or I swear I'll trigger the Halon system and seal this room." She laughed, a low, velvet sound that didn't reach her eyes. She moved around the table, stepping into the aisle with me. The scent of lilies and ozone flared, overpowering the dust. "You won't," she said softly. "You care about these books too much to flood the room with gas, and you're too curious to send me away yet." She took a step toward me. I didn't retreat. I couldn't. The space between us felt charged, magnetic, like the air before a lightning strike. "You're not a thief," I whispered, the realization dawning cold and heavy. You're not breathing." "Breathing is a habit," she said, closing the distance until she was just out of reach. "I gave it up a long time ago. It gets in the way of the taste." "The taste of what?" "Of longing," she murmured, her gaze dropping to my mouth, then back to my eyes. Yours is exquisite. It tastes like dust and desperation. I came here for the history, little archivist, but I think I found something far more volatile. You wrote, "I am becoming as brittle as the paper I save. I touch history, but nothing touches me back." Serafina recited the words from memory, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated against my ribs. She didn't need the journal. She had consumed it. The words hit me like a physical blow. Hearing them in my own head was pathetic enough. Hearing them spoken by this creature, this beautiful, impossible intruder, was unbearable. It stripped me naked, right there, in the aisle. "Stop," I said, my voice shaking. "You don't get to use that." "But it's true, isn't it?" She took another step. I took one back. "You surround yourself with things that have already lived their lives. Parchment, leather, ink, safe things, dead things. You think if you stand still enough among them, death will mistake you for one of its own and pass you by." "I'm a conservator," I argued, retreating until my heels hit the metal edge of the flat file map cabinets. "I preserve knowledge." "You preserve dust," she corrected, her eyes scanning my face, dissecting me with surgical precision. "You're terrified of the living, Noah. People are messy. They leave, they change, they die without permission. But a book stays exactly where you put it. You've buried yourself in this concrete box not to save these manuscripts, but to hide from the fact that you're burning up with a heat you don't know what to do with." My breath hitched. It was infuriating. It was terrifying. And God help me, it was electric. No one had ever looked at me and seen the fire behind the quiet professional facade. They just saw the cardigan, the gloves, the silence. She saw the arsonist waiting for a match. "You're projecting," I spat, trying to regain some ground, though my pulse was hammering a traitorous rhythm against my collarbone. "You broke in here to play amateur psychologist? You're just a trespasser with a god complex." Her smile sharpened, revealing just a hint of something white and dangerous against her lip. "Trespasser? You assume this building belongs to the living just because you hold the keys?" She moved then, faster than my eyes could track. One moment she was 2 feet away. The next, she was looming over me, her hands planted on the map cabinet on either side of my waist. I was trapped. The metal of the cabinet dug into my lower back, grounding me in the reality of the danger. But my mind was spinning. The smell of her, ozone, lilies, and something metallic like old copper, filled my throat. She wasn't touching me. Not yet. But her presence was a weight, pressing against my skin. The air between us thickened, turning viscous. A sudden, biting frost emanated from her, clashing with the flush of heat rising in my cheeks. The silence of the library, usually so comforting, now felt like a held breath, waiting for the snap. "I find the books boring," she murmured, leaning down until her face was inches from mine. I could see the flecks of silver in her irises, ancient and cold. "They tell stories that are finished. But you are a story that's still being written, and I'm very interested in the next chapter." "I'm not a book for you to read," I managed to say, though the words lacked air. "Aren't you?" Her gaze dropped to my throat, tracking the frantic pulse fluttering there. "You've been reading my journals, Noah. You've been living in my head. It's only fair I get to live in yours." I tried to shove past her. It was a reflex, a desperate attempt to reclaim the physical boundaries she had dismantled with a few words. My hand came up to push against her shoulder, expecting the give of flesh and bone. Instead, it was like striking a marble column. She didn't budge. In the same motion, her hand shot out, wrapping around my wrist. The shock was immediate and violent. It wasn't just cold, It was the absolute zero of deep space, a temperature that shouldn't exist in a living world. It burned like dry ice against my pulse point, shocking the fight out of my muscles. I gasped, the sound sharp and loud in the quiet between the stacks. But I couldn't pull away. Her grip was iron, a shackle that locked me into her orbit. "I didn't intend for this," she said, her voice dropping to a murmur that vibrated against my skin. She didn't let go. If anything, her grip tightened, grounding me in the reality of her strength. "I came here to taste the ink, Noah, to remember who I was before the years blurred everything together into a gray smear. But then I saw you." She stepped closer, her body pressing me firmly against the metal drawer handles. A glacial chill pressed through the fabric of my shirt, turning the sweat on my skin to ice. "I saw the way you handle the pages, the reverence, and I realized the history on the shelves is dead. You are the only thing in this tomb that is actually alive." "Let me go," I whispered, but the words lacked conviction. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, betraying the lie. "No," she answered simply. "You've spent your whole life preserving things, keeping them safe behind glass. You live in a state of suspended animation. Let's see what happens when you break." She didn't lean in slowly. She struck. Her mouth captured mine with a hunger that had nothing to do with romance. It wasn't a request. It was an annexation. I tried to gasp, to protest, but the sound was swallowed by the sheer force of her. Her lips were cold, shockingly so, tasting of dark wine, the mineral tang of old stone, and the dust of centuries. It was a silencing, sharp and absolute. My hands, which had been raised to push her away, faltered. They found the lapels of her coat instead, clutching the fabric not to shove, but to hold on. The fear that had been paralyzing me dissolved into something heavier, darker. It was a surrender I hadn't known I was capable of. It was terrifying. The pull I had read about in folklore was real, but it wasn't magic. It was chemistry. It was the sudden, violent realization that I had been waiting for this collision my entire life. She made a sound in her throat, a low growl of satisfaction, and deepened the kiss. Her tongue swept into my mouth, mapping the heat she found there with deliberate precision. I felt the cold spread from my lips down through my chest, chasing away the warmth, replacing it with a shivering, electric need. I wasn't an archivist anymore. I wasn't a guardian of the past. The kiss rewrote the architecture of my world, tearing down my solitude and replacing it with her cold fire. When she finally pulled back, I nearly collapsed. The map cabinet was the only thing keeping me upright. My lungs heaved, dragging in air that felt too thin, too warm. Serafina looked at me, her eyes blown wide, the pupils swallowing the iris. Her mouth was red, swollen, and I realized with a jolt that it was from me. "Consider that the prologue," she whispered, her thumb brushing my lower lip, tracing the damage she'd done. The touch was possessive, marking me. "I told you, Noah, I don't read for the plot. I read for the character arc. And yours is just getting interesting." I blinked, trying to clear the haze of static from my vision. In the split second my eyes closed, the air shifted. The pressure against my body vanished. The scent of lilies faded, leaving only the smell of ozone and my own racing heart. I opened my eyes. The aisle was empty. She had left. The Codex Eterna sat on the table where she'd left it. My wrist still burned where she had touched me, a phantom bracelet of ice. I slid down the front of the map cabinet until I hit the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. My journal was still open on the desk in the other room, waiting for an entry I couldn't write. I didn't stay away. That was the first mistake, or maybe the first inevitable step in a dance I didn't know I was learning. I spent the daylight hours staring at my ceiling, tracing the phantom cold that still burned on my mouth, unable to scrub the sensation of her claim from my skin. My apartment felt too small, too mundane. The sunlight was offensive. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, I didn't just go to work. I was pulled there by a gravity that sat heavy in my gut. Entering the St. Jude archive that night was different. The heavy steel doors didn't just clank shut. They boomed like a cavern closing, sealing me in. The air didn't smell like vanilla and decay anymore. It smelled sharp, metallic, like the iron in blood or the copper in stripped wiring. I stopped at the top of the stairs, inhaling deeply. My senses felt stripped raw, the protective film of normal peeled away. I could hear the hum of the server room 3 floors down. I could hear the scratch of a mouse in the walls. And beneath it all, threading through the darkness like a silver wire, I could still taste her. Cold wine and ancient dust. I walked to my desk, my skin prickling with a hyper-awareness that made every shadow look like a silhouette. I wasn't alone, even if the room was empty. The ghost of her presence was stamped into the concrete. And then I saw it. On the center of my blotter, exactly where my journal had been the night before, sat a book. It wasn't one from our collection. This was smaller, bound in black leather that looked like it had absorbed the light around it. It wasn't cataloged. There was no call number on the spine. My hands shook as I reached for it. I didn't need gloves. The leather was warm, humming faintly, as if it had just left a pocket. I opened it. It wasn't a printed text. It was a manuscript, handwritten in a script I recognized instantly, the same sharp, elegant hand that had annotated the Vane collection. But the ink was fresh. For the archivist who prefers the dead, the note on the flyleaf read, "A history of silence, written before the ink dried. Read it. Then tell me if you still prefer the safety of the grave." It wasn't a threat. It was a courtship. Serafina wasn't sending flowers or chocolates. She was sending me lost history. She was speaking the only language I truly understood: preservation. She knew that the lure of a lost text was stronger than my fear of the predator who gave it. I ran my thumb over the paper. It felt like skin. The intimacy of the gift made my knees weak. She was courting me with the very thing I used to hide from the world, turning my shield into an invitation. But the reverence of the moment shattered with the sound of the elevator dinging. It was 11 p.m. No one came down here at this hour. I shoved the black book into my bottom drawer and locked it, just as the doors slid open. Marcus stepped out. He wasn't alone. 2 other members of the board of directors, suits that cost more than my salary, eyes that looked dead, flanked him. But Marcus was the one who mattered. He was the night supervisor, a man who moved with the heavy, predatory grace of a bear. I had always disliked him. Tonight, my dislike curdled into visceral alarm. "Noah," he said, his voice a gravel slide. "Working late again." "It's my shift, Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It sounded too loud in my own ears. He didn't stop at the counter. He walked right into the lab, ignoring the authorized personnel only sign. The other 2 fanned out, their eyes scanning the shelves not for books, but for something else. "We're doing a spot audit," Marcus said, stopping 3 feet from me. He didn't look at the humidity logs on my screen. He looked at me. He tilted his head, his nostrils flaring slightly. "There's been a disturbance in the environmental controls. Anomalies. Cold spots." "The HVAC is old," I lied. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Marcus stepped closer, invading my personal space. The smell of him was overwhelming. Cheap cologne, stale coffee, and something underlying it all that smelled like wet dog. It made me nauseous. "It's not the HVAC," he said softly. He leaned in, sniffing the air around me. His eyes narrowed. "You smell different, Noah." I froze. "I changed my laundry detergent." "No," he rumbled, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "You smell like ozone and frost." He looked at my neck, then my mouth. His gaze lingered on my lips, and I felt a flash of panic so sharp it nearly bent me double. He knew. Or he suspected. "You've been in the restricted section," he accused, his voice losing its bureaucratic veneer. "Who are you with?" "No one," I snapped, the anger flaring up to mask the fear. "I work alone. You know that." "Do I?" Marcus turned to the drawer I had just locked. He reached for the handle. "Open it." "That's personal property," I said, stepping between him and the desk. It was a stupid move. Marcus was twice my size. But the territorial rage I'd felt last night was back, hotter this time. That book was mine. She gave it to me. Marcus stared at me, and for a second, his eyes shifted. A flash of yellow in the fluorescent light. "You're protecting something, Noah, and it smells like the enemy." He backed off, but the threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "We'll be watching," he said. "The archive doesn't tolerate pests. Or the people who feed them." As the elevator doors closed on his retreating back, I realized the truth. Serafina hadn't just marked me with a kiss. She had painted a target on my back. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was bait. Marcus didn't wait for the elevator doors to close before he cornered me. He found me an hour later in the map room, a dead-end aisle filled with oversized flat files and the smell of oxidizing copper. He didn't look like a supervisor anymore. He looked like a hound that had caught a scent but lost the trail. He stood between me and the exit, his bulk blocking the fluorescent light, casting a shadow that felt heavy enough to bruise. "You're nervous, Noah," he said. It wasn't a question. He took a step closer, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum. "You're checking the corners, you're jumping at the settling noises of the building. Why?" "I told you," I said, gripping the handle of a map drawer behind me to keep my hands from shaking. "The HVAC is acting up. It's messing with the preservation standards." "It's not the HVAC." Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "We tracked a thermal anomaly in the West Wing last night, 7 degrees cooler than the ambient temperature, moving against the airflow. That's not a draft, Noah. That's a target." My stomach turned over. The jargon had shifted. He wasn't talking about maintenance anymore. He was talking about tracking. The board wasn't a group of donors or academics. They were hunters, and Marcus was the lead hound. I realized then, with a sick clarity, that he wasn't interrogating me because he thought I was incompetent. He was doing it because he knew I was the lure. He was squeezing me to see if the predator would come out to protect its territory. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice tight. "Don't you?" He reached out, his hand hovering near my shoulder, close enough that I could feel the heat of his skin. It was suffocating. "You have a mark on you, a scent. It's faint, but it's there, like something dead that refuses to rot. If you're hiding something..." The air pressure in the room dropped. The hum of the ventilation system cut out, replaced by a silence so absolute it made my ears pop. "I believe," a cool, familiar voice cut through the tension, "that the archivist is busy." Marcus spun around. I looked past him. Serafina stood at the entrance of the aisle. She wasn't wearing the leather coat from the night before. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that screamed old money and boardrooms, her hair pinned up in a severe, elegant chignon. She didn't look like a creature of the night. She looked like she owned the building. and everyone in it. But her eyes were the same. Dark, reflective, unblinking. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, his hand drifting toward his jacket pocket. "Seraphina Vane," she said, walking toward us. She moved with a fluid grace that made Marcus look clumsy and coarse. She didn't look at me. She kept her gaze locked on him, a silent challenge. "My family endowed this collection. I'm here for a scheduled consultation regarding the preservation of the original deed." It was a lie, smooth and perfect. Marcus hesitated. He knew the name. It was on half the plaques in the lobby, but he also knew what his senses were telling him. I watched the conflict play out in the micro-expressions of his face, the twitch of his nostril, the tightening of his jaw. He was a hunter in the presence of a tiger disguised as a house cat, and he wasn't sure if he should strike or bow. "I wasn't informed of a visit," Marcus said, his voice rough. "I don't inform the night staff," Seraphina replied, stopping 3 feet from him. The temperature around her was noticeably cooler. "I informed the directors. Unless you'd like me to call them and explain why you're harassing the lead conservator instead of doing your rounds?" It was a power move, dominance disguised as bureaucracy. Marcus looked from her to me, his eyes narrowing. He was cornered by protocol, but he wasn't done. "Noah," he said, not looking away from Seraphina. "Is this true? Did you schedule this?" The room seemed to tilt. This was the trap. If I said no, Marcus had cause to detain her, to escalate this into violence right here among the maps. If I said yes, I was aligning myself with the thing that had broken into my lab and stolen my breath. I looked at Seraphina. Her face was impassive, a marble mask, but her eyes held mine, a silent, heavy weight. "Choose," they said. I looked back at Marcus. I hated the smell of him. I hated the way he made me feel small. "Yes," I lied, the word tasting like copper and adrenaline. "Ms. Vane contacted me directly. I forgot to log it in the shift report." The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Marcus stared at me, searching for the crack in the veneer. He saw the defiance, but he didn't see the fear. Not anymore. "Fine," he spat, stepping back. He adjusted his jacket, his glare moving between us. "But the audit continues. Don't leave the building." He turned and marched out, his footsteps heavy and angry. Seraphina didn't move until the elevator doors dinged and slid shut. Then she exhaled, and the human mask slipped just enough to reveal the predator beneath. "He knows," she said softly. "But now, he knows you're mine." The silence following Marcus's departure was heavier than the confrontation itself. It wasn't empty. It was pressurized. Seraphina turned to me, her expression stripping away the boardroom persona she'd worn for the hunter. "You should have given me up," she said, her voice low. "He's a wolf, Noah. You just put yourself between his teeth and his meal. Why?" I looked at the map cabinets, the familiar geography of my life that now felt like a battlefield. "Because he scares me," I admitted. "But you terrify me. And I think I prefer the terror." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." I stepped closer, drawn into the radius of her unnatural winter. "You changed the architecture of my world, Seraphina. When you touched me, you didn't just take something. You left something behind. I can't go back to being the person who just dusts the shelves." She studied me, her eyes softening into something dangerously like regret. "Then you need to know the story you're actually in. Marcus isn't just a hunter. He's a sapper for the Iron Faction. They don't care about the books, Noah. They care about what's underneath them." She gestured to the concrete floor. "The archive isn't just a basement. It's a capstone. You know the Vane name is on the deed, but you think it's just history. It's not. I didn't just donate the collection in 1944. I built this vault to seal a ley line, a vein of deep earth energy. My mind reeled, the pieces finally clicking into place. The handwriting in the margins I'd studied for years, the possessiveness, the age in her eyes. "You're the source," I whispered. "You're the one who wrote the notes." "I check on my investments," she said simply. "That's why the books survive here. That's why you feel so alive in the dark. It feeds you." And Marcus? He intends to shatter the seal and drain the energy for his faction's war machine. If he succeeds, everything here, the history, the building, and you, will turn to dust. The stakes snapped into focus. It wasn't a turf war. It was an execution of history. "How do we stop him?" "We need the heart," she said. "The anchor stone. It's hidden in the catalog, disguised as a book. I know what it looks like, but not where it's shelved. The filing system has changed since 1944. "I know the system," I said, professional instinct overriding fear. "Describe it." We moved. For the next hour, the dynamic shifted. We weren't predator and prey. We were partners. I navigated the labyrinth of Dewey Decimal changes while she translated the archaic riddles her ancestors left behind. Our minds meshed with terrifying ease. I finished her sentences. She anticipated my turns. It was intimate, a cerebral dance as charged as the physical one. We reached the sub-basement, a level unauthorized for anyone, searching through uncatalogued geological surveys. I reached for a heavy folio, my haste making me careless. The paper's edge, sharp as a razor, sliced my thumb. "Ah!" I hissed, pulling back. A bead of bright red blood welled up, stark against the dust. The room froze. Seraphina stopped. Her back went rigid. She turned slowly, eyes locking onto the blood with a hunger that made the shadows recoil. "Noah," she warned, voice strained. I didn't hide it. I held my hand out. "It's just a cut." She crossed the distance in a blur, taking my hand. Her skin was ice against my fever warmth. She didn't bite. She brought my hand to her face, inhaling the copper scent, eyes fluttering shut. Then, with a tenderness that shattered me, she licked the wound. It wasn't feeding. It was sealing. Her saliva was cold, numbing the sting instantly. The sensation was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated connection traveling from my thumb straight to my spine. She pulled back, lips stained faintly pink. "You are dangerous," she whispered, thumb brushing the healed skin. "You bleed too easily." "And you heal too quickly," I replied, breathless. The moment hung suspended in the dark, heavy with the promise of what could happen if we stopped searching. Then the world screamed. Emergency klaxons erupted overhead, a jarring, rhythmic shriek killing the silence instantly. Red strobe lights spun, painting the stacks in violence. "He's back," Seraphina said, face hardening into marble. And he didn't come alone. The glass of the upper atrium shattered first, raining down like jagged hail onto the marble lobby floor. Then came the boots. Heavy, rhythmic, unconcerned with the silence they were murdering. Marcus hadn't brought a security team. He had brought a full, ruthless demolition crew. "Stay behind me," Seraphina commanded. Her voice had changed, the velvet smoothness replaced by the rasp of tectonic plates shifting. She wasn't a donor anymore. Her pale skin pulled tight against her cheekbones, her fingers lengthened, and the air around her dropped 20 degrees. They flowed into the stacks like oil, men in tactical gear carrying weapons too advanced for security, too archaic for warfare. Silver-edged blades, UV emitters. They weren't here to audit. They were here to purge. "Burn it!" Marcus roared from the mezzanine. "Flush them out!" A Molotov cocktail shattered against a row of 19th century periodicals. The pungent smell of kerosene mixed with the ozone, a profane perfume. That mistake ended my fear and woke my rage. They weren't just attacking me, they were burning my world. Seraphina moved. She didn't run. She vanished from stillness and reappeared in the center of the first squad. It was a blur of violence my eyes couldn't track, only the aftermath. Bodies thrown like rag dolls against steel shelves, the sickening crunch of bone meeting concrete, the spray of blood hitting book spines I'd spent years preserving. She was a storm of razor claws and dark shadow, tearing through them with terrifying efficiency. But there were simply too many of them pouring in. 2 mercenaries flanked left, aiming for the sub-basement access. I didn't hide. I knew this building's bones. I sprinted down the parallel aisle, reaching the control panel for the automated rolling stacks. These were 3-ton steel blocks on motorized tracks. I punched the override code with trembling fingers. "Hey!" one mercenary shouted, raising his rifle. I slammed the collapse button. The heavy gears ground together with a deafening screech. The aisle closed in seconds. They realized too late the walls were moving. One managed to scramble out. The other screamed as the steel carriages slammed together, locking with a final, crushing thud. I didn't stop to vomit, even though my stomach roiled violently. I kept moving, using the shadows Seraphina had taught me to navigate. Then, I ran into Marcus. He was waiting for me at the far end of the geography wing, holding a flare gun. He looked massive, a solid wall of pure malice. "You're a nuisance, Noah," he spat, aiming not at me, but at the Vane collection behind me. "No!" I lunged, but I was too slow. He pulled the trigger. A shadow intercepted it. Seraphina materialized in front of the shelf, taking the burning magnesium round straight to the chest. She hissed, a terrible sound like steam escaping a valve, as fire ate into her coat and skin. The sickening smell of burning flesh filled the narrow aisle, acrid and sweet. "Seraphina!" I screamed. She fell to one knee. Marcus laughed, reloading. "Sentimental trash. She dies, then you die." He stepped forward to finish her, standing directly on the halon gas release grate. I smashed the do not touch cage on the wall and yanked the emergency lever. Pressurized, freezing gas blasted upward, blinding him. He staggered back, hacking and coughing, disoriented by the sudden oxygen vacuum. "Now!" I yelled. Seraphina launched herself from the floor. Wounded, smoking, but still a predator, she hit Marcus like a freight train. They crashed violently into the map cabinet, deeply denting the reinforced steel. Her hand, claws fully extended, punched through his tactical vest and buried itself in his chest. Marcus gasped, eyes wide, looking at me one last time. "History," Seraphina whispered into his ear, "is written by the survivors." She ripped her hand back. Marcus slumped to the floor, motionless. The silence returned to the room, heavy and ringing. The fires flickered, dying without fuel. The sharp smell of copper was overwhelming. Seraphina turned to me, blood slicking her hand, chest burned, eyes wild. We were alive. But the library was now a graveyard. The cleanup was quiet, a grim ritual of restoration. We didn't speak as we dragged the bodies to the service elevator, heavy, lifeless weights that left dark streaks on the polished concrete. I scrubbed the floor with industrial solvent, the chemical sting burning my nose, fighting to erase the copper scent of violence. Seraphina sat on the edge of the reading table, the shredded remains of her charcoal suit jacket discarded on the floor. I watched, mesmerized, as the charred skin on her chest knit itself back together. It wasn't magic. It was biological acceleration, cells regenerating with a faint, wet sound that should have been repulsive, but was strangely fascinating. She looked up, catching my stare. The wildness was gone from her eyes, replaced by a weary stillness. "You should go," she said, her voice rough, lacking its usual velvet polish. "Marcus was just a lieutenant. Others will come. If I leave tonight, the heat follows me. You can go back to being a ghost in your own library, You can forget the taste of ozone. I paused, the scrub brush dripping gray water into the bucket. The offer hung in the air, sensible and safe. I could go back to the silence. I could lock the doors and pretend the night had never happened. But looking at her, healed but haunted, a creature of history sitting in the wreckage of the present, I knew the truth. The silence wasn't enough anymore. It never really had been. I don't want to be a ghost, I said, dropping the brush. It splashed, loud and final. And I'm not cleaning up this mess just so you can run away to protect me. She stood, moving toward me with that fluid, unnerving grace. The predator was still there, coiled under the surface, but the aggression had shifted into something fiercely protective. Noah, staying means you bleed. It means you look over your shoulder every night, waiting for the next breach. I was already looking over my shoulder, I countered, standing my ground as she entered my personal space. I was just looking for the wrong things. I'm not asking for safety, Seraphina. I'm asking for terms. She stopped, intrigued, her head tilting slightly. Terms? Equal footing, I said, my voice steady, despite the traitorous flutter in my pulse. No more breaking into my lab. No more reading my journal without permission. My thoughts are mine until I choose to give them to you. I am not a book for you to browse. A small, sharp smile touched her lips, genuine this time. And the rest? The rest. I stepped closer until the ice in her veins brushed against my heat. The claim remains. I can handle the danger. I can't handle the empty room. She reached out, her hand cupping my jaw. Her skin was cool, startling against the sweat and grime on my face. You preserve things because you're afraid they'll disappear, she murmured. I thought you were fragile, Noah. Paper and dust. But you're binding leather. Tougher than you look. Deal? I asked. Deal. We spent the rest of the night reshelving. It was a domestic act, absurdly normal after the carnage. We moved in tandem, lifting heavy folios and aligning spines. The rhythm of it, lift, slide, align, settled the adrenaline in my blood. There was an intimacy in it, sharing the weight of history, her cold hands brushing mine as we restored order to the chaos. As dawn threatened the upper windows with gray light, we sat on the floor of the rare book swing. Seraphina held the Codex Eterna, but this time, she didn't read silently. She read aloud. Her voice was a low hum, translating the Latin into a cadence that sounded like music. I leaned my head against her shoulder, the cold no longer shocking, just grounding. The predator had been tamed by the work, or perhaps the archivist had been corrupted by the predator. I didn't care which. The heavy steel doors clicked shut, the sound echoing with a finality that didn't frighten me anymore. I wasn't just preserving the past. I was living in a dangerous, eternal present. Seraphina's hand rested over mine, cold, heavy, and permanent. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. If you want to see what other secrets are buried in the dark, subscribe for the next chapter of The Legacy.